Hi everyone, I'm Veronica Jones. I'm mother to Thea Swetic, and I'm feeling so lucky to be with you all today. You guys have all been our lifeline, knowing that you're working with TANGO2, and that your families, the connections we've made, have just been a lifeline for us. So thank you so much. Thea is 7 years old, and she loves going to gymnastics class and tennis and swim, and she has TANGO2, but it doesn't stop her from doing anything, and she's never tired. We're here from San Diego, California, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Erica Lay is a clinical research fellow and clinical instructor in the Department of Molecular and Human Genetics at Baylor College of Medicine. She completed medical school and pediatric medical genetics registry at Baylor College of Medicine as well. Her time during her research fellowship has focused on describing genetic conditions with dilated cardiomyopathy, like LMOD2-associated dilated cardiomyopathy and TANGO2-related disorder. After completing her research fellowship, she plans on practicing as a pediatric medical geneticist. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erica Lay.
Thank you, Veronica, for that introduction, and hello to you all. So I am going to talk today about TANGO2-related disease and give a just broad overview and just provide a foundation for the rest of our time here today and talking about it, especially from a medical genetics perspective. And so the specific things I'm going to highlight today are genetics of TANGO2-related disorder, the common signs and symptoms, typical management for this disease, and future steps and some of my predictions when it comes to TANGO2 research, but also clinical care. I'll just start off and say there are many names I think that we have all used related to TANGO2-related disease. I have referred to it as T2D in just my talk specifically, just to make things shorter. But TANGO2-related disorder is another name. TANGO2 deficiency disorder, or TDD. MERCN, or MERCN, which stands for metabolic crises recurrent with rhabdomyolysis, cardiac arrhythmias, and neurodegeneration. And lastly, TANGO2-related metabolic encephalopathy and arrhythmias. The last two really describe the more severe symptoms, whereas the others really focus on the gene itself. And giving a broad overview of genetics. So within the human body, as we all know, there are many different organs and tissues, and if you look at each of those organs and tissues, it's made up of all these cells, and for the most part, most of the cells in our body contain what is called DNA, which provides a code or instructions to make us develop into humans, but also to help with our daily bodily functions. And if we looked at DNA under a microscope and did a couple of treatments to it, we'd be able to see what are called chromosomes, or as you can see in this graphic, these sticks with a bunch of bands and stripes on it, and where there are typically 46 chromosomes in a person. 23 come from mom, 23 come from dad. But I will be focusing on chromosome 22 for the moment because that is the chromosome where the TANGO2 gene is located. I kind of describe the location as the zip code, and the zip code I'm going to be using and probably saying quite frequently is 22Q11.21. That probably matters more to a lot of us geneticists when we talk to each other about locations of genes, but I think that it will, hopefully I will make it apparent how important that zip code or location is. And so now going into and just talking about the gene itself, TANGO2 stands for Transport and Golgi Organization 2. 2 just stands for the second Transport and Golgi Organization protein that has been found. And like I mentioned before, how DNA provides the instructions to make us who we are, proteins are what is used to actually have those functions. The normal function for TANGO2, we don't exactly know what it does. However, it is suspected to move proteins within the cell and between cells. And the location of those the TANGO2 protein, it's pretty much everywhere, but I listed here the brain, heart, thyroid, gastrointestinal system, blood, and muscle as the most common places where it will be seen. And we talk later about the signs and symptoms, which I know you guys already know, but it makes sense that the TANGO2 protein is present in these specific tissues because of the symptoms that are seen. So now just talking about, well, what happens if the instructions or the TANGO2 gene and the code is changed or abnormal? Well, it does lead to a decrease in TANGO2 protein, hence the alternate name for TANGO2-related disease as TANGO2 deficiency. And so I will just talk about inheritance now that I'm talking about the abnormal changes that can happen in the TANGO2 gene. The genetic term for the inheritance is autosomal recessive, but that just essentially means that both copies of TANGO2, again, like I mentioned before, one copy comes from mom, one copy comes from dad, that both copies somehow become changed and lead to disease. And I'll also say that other diseases, maybe just one copy is changed that leads to the disease, but in this case, both copies. And within the people that are enrolled in our natural history study, majority of the children have parents who are carriers, meaning they don't have TANGO2-related disorder, but they do have one copy that is changed. And if by chance both of those copies that are abnormal get passed down to their child, then that's what leads to TANGO2-related disease in the child. Alternatively, there are other, they may not always have children with TANGO2-related disorder. So for parents who are carriers, if one copy is passed down, that's normal, and the other copy is abnormal, then that child is actually a carrier for TANGO2-related disease and does not have it. And then, of course, if it's switched, the other parents give the abnormal copy and the normal copy, then there's also this chance that the child will also be a carrier. And then there's also a chance that if parents are carriers, they could pass normal copies of the TANGO2 gene to their child. Their child is completely unaffected and are not carriers. So just summarizing all of that, I did just put percentages and the chances for parents who are confirmed carriers and what those risks are for their future pregnancies. So there's a 25% or a 1 in 4 chance that the child will have TANGO2-related disorder. There's a 50% chance or 2 in 4 chance that each child would be a carrier, and a 25% chance or 1 in 4 chance that the child will be completely unaffected and will not even be a carrier either. And I also wanted to emphasize there are a few enrolled in our natural history study where actually only one parent is a carrier and the other parent has completely normal copies of the TANGO2 gene. So it is possible for that parent who is a carrier to still pass on the abnormal TANGO2 gene by chance, but that even though the other copy would typically be normal from the other parent, there can be what we call spontaneous or just new mutations just in the child and still have TANGO2-related disease. And we also have about 4 individuals enrolled in the natural history study that have 2 genetic diagnoses, TANGO2-related disorder and 22q11.2 deletion syndrome. I did want to mention it because they have the same zip code of 22q11.2, but the difference is that those that have both, they have what's called a bigger deletion, or a larger missing piece of that 22q11.2 zip code that is missing and has a number of other genes surrounding the TANGO2 gene that's missing. So next I wanted to talk about how common is TANGO2-related disease. These estimates are from the Broad Institute, which is a research organization between MIT and Harvard, and they have calculated that the carrier frequency for TANGO2-related disorder is 1 in 566 people. So I did my own little calculations of, well, there's 2,462 rooms at this resort. On average, if there are 3 people staying in each of those rooms, then it's about 7,400 people that could be at this resort at capacity. And so if you take that and do a little bit of math, the 7,400 divided by 566, there could potentially be 13 people who are carriers for TANGO2-related disease. I know that doesn't apply here because we're at a TANGO2 family conference, but I just thought might as well give out some numbers to provide some context. So in terms of how common is it around the world, based on these numbers, about 6,000 people are thought to have this disease. So, and this is based on a world population of 7.7 billion people. And I also just wanted to mention the frequency of DIGEORGE syndrome. It is fairly common as it relates to other genetic conditions, and that there are 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 6,000 births, where some other conditions could be 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 1 million. So now that I've just focused a lot on the genes and inheritance, I just want to talk more broadly now about symptoms, because clearly those changes affect the body. I also will preface that not every person with TANGO2-related disorder will have the same symptoms as someone else from another family, or maybe they may have different symptoms from their own sibling. Let's say mom, same dad. I think what's unique about TANGO2-related disease are the timing of symptoms. So bear with me as I sort of go through the timing of everything, and then I will talk about the specific symptoms. So I think that there are these baseline symptoms that are always there. They could improve, they could get worse, but for the most part, there are some symptoms. And then there are also episodic symptoms, meaning there's just symptoms that happen for a short period of time and then they go away. And then there are more severe symptoms, which are metabolic crises or cardiac crises, where the symptoms are much more severe, the course is much more prolonged, and may take longer to recover than the amount of time it took to even see the symptoms in the first place. So some of these baseline symptoms include developmental delays with sitting, walking, running, saying first words or speaking sentences, reading, using their hands, using with fine motor skills like using utensils, scribbling, or writing. Feeding, there could be feeding difficulties, swallowing difficulties that may require a feeding tube. Speech and difficulties in that maybe other people who are not related to them may have difficulties understanding what they say. They may have unsteady walking or balance. They may have increased muscle stiffness, or the medical term is spasticity. They could have seizures, low thyroid function or hypothyroidism, strabismus, which I used a graphic here where essentially the eyes just may not look in the same direction, as well as constipation, and then few have hearing loss. And so I did want to talk about baseline symptoms for those with TANGO2-related disease and DIGEORGE syndrome, because there is a lot of overlap, and it may be difficult to discern without having genetic testing done that these two syndromes would be entirely different. So bolded on the left are all the similar symptoms, and then here on the right in blue, I've sort of highlighted that they can have, those with DiGeorge syndrome can have very distinct facial features. Commonly, it's the nose with with a bulbous tip, and sometimes the nostrils themselves are smaller, as well as a smaller chin, cleft lip or cleft palate, very specific types of congenital heart disease, skeleton changes like changes in the spine, and sometimes they're born with kidney anomalies. And so I think what sets apart the DiGeorge syndrome and TANGO2-related disorders are what our group calls spells. These episodes that last for a short period of time, minutes to hours, and that's not seen in those who have DiGeorge syndrome only. And I also think that this is a unique part of TANGO2-related disease. So some of those symptoms include extreme tiredness, worsened unsteady walking to the point that maybe they may not walk. There could be stiffness just on certain sides of the body that tend to resolve. They may also have head tilts, slurring of speech, drooling, or eyelid drooping. The medical term for that is ptosis. And like I mentioned, the episodes seem to resolve on their own, but based on input from families from the natural history study, it seems like sleep or snacks or drinks with sugar can help. And the other distinguishing feature, which I'll talk about metabolic crises next, but just emphasizing that a lot of these families will go to the ER, see their doctors, they have a number of labs done, and there are no lab abnormalities to explain the symptoms. And so now talking about the more severe symptoms, the prolonged symptoms that typically require hospitalization. These are metabolic crises. Some of the known triggers are illness or fasting for whatever reason. And some of the symptoms are similar to the spells, and so it may be difficult to tease out. Some of the differences may be that they may not be as responsive, they are not wanting to eat or drink, they have significant muscle weakness, and they may even have what's called tea-colored urine. So I just put a picture of that to give you a little graphic, but that's just an indicator of muscle breakdown. The medical term for that is rhabdomyolysis. And they can also have seizures. I'll put asterisks next to seizures because, like I mentioned before, that can be a baseline symptom, but could also be a sign of metabolic crisis as well. So like I mentioned for spells where there typically aren't any lab abnormalities, metabolic crises do have lab abnormalities, hence the term metabolic crisis. There can be low blood sugars or glucose, elevated creatine kinase or CK, which is an indicator of, again, muscle breakdown or rhabdomyolysis. The blood is typically more acidic or low pH. The liver enzymes or liver function tests can show elevated AST, ALT. There could be elevated ammonia, or the chemical symbol is NH3. And there can be myoglobin present in the urine, and that is what produces the T color in urine. And another distinguishing feature is that there are heart rhythm changes, particularly on an EKG, which you will see in the red strip above the other image at the bottom, that there's a specific interval on an EKG heart rhythm tracing of QT that ends up being prolonged in a crisis. And so now that I've talked about metabolic crisis, I wanted to provide more details on metabolic cardiac crisis. So symptoms can be very similar to a metabolic crisis. Maybe some of the differences are that there's loss of consciousness in the child, or they may even go into cardiac arrest, where the heart stops and blood is not pumping throughout the body. The lab abnormalities can be exactly the same, just like a metabolic crisis without extensive heart involvement. So I wanted to highlight some of the findings regarding the heart. There could be rhythm changes, heart anatomy changes, as well as heart function changes. For the rhythm changes, like I mentioned, the EKG or tracings of the heart would show prolonged QT interval, just like a metabolic crisis, but there are also specific patterns of the tracing, like Brugada pattern, ventricular tachycardia, or Torsades points. And in terms of the heart anatomy, electrocardiogram or a heart ultrasound could show dilated heart chambers. If you see on the bottom right-hand corner, the dilated cardiomyopathy just shows the enlarged heart chambers. And in terms of heart function, that also is seen by echocardiogram, and would show that it's decreased. In terms of treatment, I'm going to go back and talk about sort of the baseline symptoms, what would be seen in clinic. But overall, there unfortunately is no cure at this time, and I wish I had more time to talk about all the treatments for all the different symptoms that we discussed, but typically this is the list of potential specialists who would be involved in a child's care with TANGO2-related disorder. So a geneticist and possibly a metabolic geneticist. I will say that there aren't, as a geneticist myself, there aren't very many metabolic specialists. So you may just have what we call a general geneticist helping. There are also neurologists for seizures, for brain development, cardiologists for the heart risks, endocrinologists for thyroid, gastroenterologists for constipation management, but also for nutrition with a dietitian involved, and ophthalmologists because of the eye movements, a neurodevelopmental pediatrician because of monitoring development and milestone achievement over time, an ear, nose, and throat doctor because of hearing loss, and physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor for any equipment needs or helping with recovery after a severe metabolic crisis episode. And then, of course, physical, occupational, and speech therapy to really build up that potential for developmental milestone achievement. And then, now I talked about the clinic, now I'm talking about, well, what would typically happen in the hospital. Fluids would be given with sugar or dextrose. Nutrition, there's a heavy emphasis on trying to give nutrition by mouth, by feeding tube, through the blood, by TPN or total parenteral nutrition. There may be seizure medications or rescue medications given, antiarrhythmia medications, or extra electrolytes like magnesium, potassium, or calcium, heart failure medications if that is a concern. And a lot of the specialists are going to be the same that would be seen in a clinic. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about prevention of metabolic and cardiac crises. A lot of it is just taking precautions and preventive measures like try not to get sick. And I'm sure through the pandemic that's been a very different challenge. Avoid prolonged fasting, and that may involve giving fluids before any surgeries because most anesthesiologists don't want any food in the gut before a surgery. Avoiding a ketogenic diet, which is a diet that's high in fat, but low in carbohydrates. And because I'm talking a lot about diet, in terms of prevention, is there a role? That's just a question I will have. Is there a role for nutrition for a long-term benefit to prevent some of these very severe prolonged symptoms? And just some notes about emergency planning, especially the way that we do it at Baylor College of Medicine in our center. There is an emergency letter that we give to all patients with a metabolic condition that describes their condition, what the risks are, and just early workup so that there isn't delay in starting care from the moment they're seen. Identifying a local hospital that is trusted and may eventually know the child well over time, but if the local hospital in emergency situations doesn't know, then establishing with the center that may have all those specialists could be helpful as a resource for those local hospitals that don't have those specialists. And so these are some of the future steps that I think TANGO2-related disorder is heading. A lot of it is treatment related and being able to prevent these symptoms, whether it's baseline symptoms, these spells, or the metabolic crises. And that starts with understanding the role of TANGO2 and the protein and how those abnormal or decreased levels of TANGO2 protein lead to disease. What contributions are happening that some children have less severe symptoms and those have more severe symptoms, and what are the differences for those who don't have metabolic crisis, because we do have several children enrolled in the natural history study who've never had a metabolic crisis, and what's that difference than those who do have metabolic or cardiac crises. And of course, way in the future, but doing clinical trials if any potential treatments are identified. And then from a genetics perspective, I think that with genetic testing, I think there will be more people who are diagnosed with TANGO2-related disorder, especially because, the estimates are about 6,000 in the world, and we're probably on a scale of hundreds at this point of who we know have the disorder. And I think that more adults could be identified to be carriers with carrier screen or with carrier testing, and that I hope that more genetic testing companies add TANGO2 gene to their panels so that adults understand that they could be carriers for this condition. And I do think that relating back to those children who have DIGEORGE syndrome and TANGO2-related disease, I think we may even find more children and adults who may have both conditions as well. So thank you for your time and attention. I know this was a very brief overview, but I wish that we could probably talk for hours about TANGO2-related disorder. So I appreciate your time, your attention, the TANGO2 Research Foundation for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I want to thank specifically Dr. Lalani for being my research mentor and the entire natural history study group at Baylor College of Medicine. And I also wanted to thank the NIH who has funded my research fellowship. And that's my dog, Heidi. I guess I like to thank her too because she gives me pet therapy every day. So thank you again.